Okay. Welcome, everybody. I want to thank you for joining us this evening for our Northwest Chapter Crohn's and Colitis Foundation Patient and Caregiver Workshop on vaccines. We are hearing, obviously, a lot about vaccines in the news, and so we wanted to have an opportunity to talk about what vaccines are generally, which vaccines we suggest as a foundation that IBD patients should have and when, a little bit about how they interact with the disease as well as with various medications that many of us take, and then probably the big question that most of you are interested in, and that is that of the COVID-19 vaccines that are coming onto the market. So this is going to be a somewhat shorter presentation, about 15 minutes, and then Dr. Lord here will take time to answer your questions. Some of you did enter them in advance, and so we've got those locked and loaded. Before we get started, just a couple quick housekeeping things. We are recording this presentation tonight so that we can share it with others who are also interested. If you would like to keep your camera off, you're welcome to do that, although we love it when you keep it on. It just makes it feel a little bit more like we are all together. If you're not comfortable having your name on the screen, if you hover over your name where you see the three little ellipses dot, you can click that and it will allow you to change your name. And that might be just a little bit more comfortable for you. If you have a question, at the bottom of your screen, there's a button called chat, and you can type your question in there. If you start typing where it says to everyone, then everyone who's in the meeting will see your question. You can also change that selection so it's just to the host if you would prefer that I just read your question, if you would rather not ask it to everyone. So that's kind of the behind the scenes. With that, I want to thank our sponsors for this evening. Our partners, funding partners, are incredibly important to our being able to do these education events. So I want to thank Takeda, Seattle Children's Hospital, Swedish, Washington Gastroenterology, and Primera for helping us out with this program. So with no further ado, I will introduce our speaker. Dr. James Lord runs a translational research lab at Benaroya Research Institute and treats patients with IBD at Virginia Mason Medical Center. He obtained his MD and PhD in immunology at the University of Washington, where he also did his residency in internal medicine and his fellowship in gastroenterology. Dr. Lord serves on the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's Northwest Board of Trustees and the Chapter Medical Advisory Committee, and the Foundation's National Government and Industry Affairs Committee. He is a fierce advocate for his patients. If you're lucky enough to be one, you are truly blessed. And he is a huge proponent of the foundation, who has been a part of, I think, every education event that I've had the pleasure to do so far. So with no further ado, Dr. Lord, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can go ahead and share your screen and your presentation.
Thank you, Jody. So let's see, yes, okay. So I'm going to be talking about vaccines and IBD for adults. And I have to give the disclaimer that I am an adult gastroenterologist. I don't know very much about pediatrics, and so I'm not really qualified to comment on pediatric vaccines, which are, as most of you probably know, very different from the vaccines that are recommended for adults. And so just full disclaimer, this is really specifically about vaccines and in adulthood for people with inflammatory bowel disease. So there's a number of important questions that come up when talking to patients with IBD about vaccines. First of all, just what are you supposed to do? Which vaccines are recommended and when? And paring it down a little bit, will a vaccine actually help me if I have IBD? In other words, how protective is a vaccine? And given that the medications we use to treat IBD are actually suppressive to the immune system, will those medications make that vaccine ineffective? And then on the flip side of efficacy is safety. So will a vaccine hurt me if I have IBD? Will it make me sick? Or given that it activates the immune system, and the immune system is what causes IBD, do vaccines actually cause IBD flares? These are a lot of the questions that come up when we talk about vaccines and IBD. And then finally, the second half of this talk is going to try and give you a crash course on what we know so far about the COVID-19 vaccines that are coming out. But disclaimer there is that that's obviously a work in progress, and very little is truly known at this point. So let's see. So according to the CDC this year, there's, boy, how do I get this stuff out of here? Okay. Is there a way to remove this thing from the top? It's not. Okay. Oh, it goes away eventually. So there's a color code here that I need to run past you. So everything that's in yellow are what's called the recommended vaccination for adults who lack documentation of vaccination or lack evidence of past infection. So this is pretty much what's recommended for everybody. And then in purple are recommended vaccinations for adults who have additional risk factors, such as immunosuppression or weakened immunity or comorbidities. So it's a bit of a nuance there who gets the purple recommendations, and then it's extremely nuanced with the blue recommendations where they say shared clinical decision making, which basically means it's kind of up to you and the doctor. So there's a lot of different vaccines out there, and the CDC did put an awful lot in here. Most of this we don't really end up talking about very much. So the Tdap and the MMR are typically things that people get long before I ever meet them in clinic, so those don't really come up very much. HPV likewise is usually younger people, and if you haven't got it in your teens or childhood, then that's typically not something that's going to come up in my IBD clinic. So the bulk of what we end up talking about in IBD clinic are flu shots, pneumonia vaccine, which is on the next slide, and shingles vaccination. And so let me dwell on these for a minute. The flu shot and the flu mist are both given annually because the flu changes from year to year. So they have to build a new one every year to sort of keep up with what they think are going to be the main strains infecting us in any given winter. People with IBD, we generally recommend you get the flu shot because that can't cause any sort of an infection. The flu mist is a live vaccine. It's attenuated, but it is a live virus. So if you're on an immunosuppressant, you usually want to stay away from the mist and just get the flu shot. But if you're not on anything that suppresses your immune system, there's nothing intrinsically immunosuppressive about having inflammatory bowel disease, so it doesn't really matter which of those you get. But we do recommend that IBD patients all get a flu shot annually, even if you don't currently have a weakened immune system. We don't know what the next year is going to hold for you. So we generally recommend that in everyone now, especially this year. Shingles used to be complicated because there was something called Zostavax, which is a live attenuated vaccine. This is basically obsolete. We never talk about Zostavax anymore because a couple of years ago, Shingrix came out, which is not a live vaccine. You cannot get shingles from Shingrix. And so given that that is not alive, it is safe to give to people who are immunosuppressed. And it turns out it's actually more effective than Zostavax was. So Zostavax is neither safer nor more effective than Shingrix. So the recommendation now preferred is Shingrix, and we don't talk about Zostavax anymore. So this chart's getting simpler. And then for the pneumonia vaccine, it's a bit more nuanced. So in purple, again, this is recommended vaccination for adults with added risk factors or another indication. So the pneumonia vaccine is really only if you have any additional risk factors, unless you're over 65. Everybody over 65, no matter how healthy, is supposed to get what's called the pneumovax vaccine. It's called the 23-valent or pneumovax vaccine. But in IBD patients, we pretty much universally are recommending that they get this 13-valent vaccine called Prevnar, and then a second dose of pneumovax after so they get Prevnar, and then at least 8 weeks later, they get the pneumovax, and then after they turn 65, they get the pneumovax again. So it's kind of complicated. Pneumovax is probably the hardest one to remember. And given that purple really indicates that you have an immunosuppressed condition, a lot of people with IBD are not currently on an immunosuppressant, but if there's a chance that in the future you will be put on immunosuppressant, it's still smart to get the pneumonia vaccine series out of the way. Hepatitis, there's two hepatitis viruses for which we have vaccines, A and B. A is not a particularly dangerous virus. B can be a problem, but they come together. Something called Twinrix is both vaccines at once, and you take 2 or 3 doses over the course of a year, and that generally works pretty well. Meningococcal we're really not doing outside of college students. And then HIV is more of a children's vaccine. So the rest of these I don't really need to talk about. So to recapitulate what I said, the flu shot is annually, and it typically comes out in September. So early bird gets the worm. I recommend that you get vaccinated as close to September, October as you can. Vaccines usually all gone sometime around New Year's. And by then the flu season is well underway. So you really want to get vaccinated early in the fall. The pneumonia shot, as I said, if you're healthy, you just need a single shot once over 65. But for all IBD patients, even if you're not immunocompromised, I'm recommending you get one called Prevnar, followed by the Pneumovax 8 weeks later, and then 5 years later, and then another one 5 years, at least 5 years later after you turn 65. So a bit confusing, but you could require as much as 3 different pneumonia shots. The shingles shot is Shingrix now. And so in all comers, that is 2 shots, usually 2 to 6 months apart. And currently, if you're healthy, your insurance will only cover this if you're over 50, but we make an argument that people under 50 who have IBD should get it if they have had chickenpox as a child, or if they never got the chickenpox vaccine. The hepatitis vaccines are 3 shots over 6 months. That's a little bit of a softer indication. It's required for healthcare workers, but if you're not really at risk of being exposed to blood, your risk is pretty low. So why get a vaccine? So special considerations for IBD medications. Steroids increase your risk for all infections. So if you're ever going to be on steroids like prednisone or Solu-Medrol, the IV version, you want to protect yourself from infections. Anti-TNF agents also increase your risk of infection. It's not as bad as steroids, but the drugs like Humira and Remicade, they double your annual risk of a serious infection. Now, by double, what I actually mean is it goes from 1% per year per person to 2% per year per person. So one could say that that is a doubling. One could also say that's an absolute annual increase of 1%, which is pretty small. But most of those infections are influenza and pneumococcal pneumonia, both of which you can protect yourself from by getting vaccines. So if we vaccinate people, the extra risk of infection with an anti-TNF agent is probably pretty negligible. Xeljanz, or tofacitinib, is one of the new kids on the block. It was FDA approved just a couple of years ago for ulcerative colitis. And it increases your risk of shingles pretty dramatically. And that can be prevented with a shingles vaccine. So we do recommend shingles vaccine in anybody who is potentially taking Xeljanz. And then the thiopurines, these are really old drugs, azathioprine, 6-MP. Those increase the risk of cervical cancer in women. So women should probably get the HPV vaccine if there's any chance they may be put on a thiopurine. And regardless, we do recommend annual pap smears in women who are taking azathioprine or 6-mercaptopurine. So this is that safety data I was talking about with the anti-TNFs. So the risk of a serious infection roughly doubles, but this is unadjusted rate per 1,000 patients per year, or basically what % per year. So a 10-fold increase here is actually a 1% annual risk per capita of a serious infection, most of which were flu and pneumonia. Other things like cancer, lymphoma, solid tumors, and just death were not any different between placebo and infliximab. Infliximab is one of the, that's Remicade, that's one of the anti-TNFs. And this is from the TREAT registry, which is a fairly large, fairly long post-marketing safety trial. So Xeljanz, that newer drug, this is actually a clinical trial. It's only a 52-week study and far smaller numbers, but there was a very significant increased risk of shingles in the patients who were on the higher dose of Xeljanz, 10 milligrams twice a day. Now that's considerably lower on the lower maintenance dose of 5 milligrams twice a day. So this is a drug where, like prednisone, you want to get away with the smallest dose that you can. but usually we leave people on 10 milligrams twice a day for a few months when they first start until they're clearly in remission. And during that time, there's a very significant increased risk of shingles activation, 5% of the patients. And so this demonstrates, first of all, that there really is an increased risk of viral infections associated with this, which gives me pause in the midst of a COVID pandemic. But secondly, it's clearly a problem for herpes virus family members like zoster. Zoster shingles is a herpes virus. And so there's something about your viral immunity that's specifically compromised by Xeljanz. And then this is the cervical cancer data, or one of many studies that have shown increased risk of cervical cancer with azathioprine, which is not really seen with other immunosuppressive medications. This is a national study from Denmark that showed a small but significant increased risk of cervical cancer in women who are on azathioprine for specifically an autoimmune disease. Azathioprine is also used to prevent transplant rejection, and at high doses can be used for cancer, but that's pretty rare now. So one of the big questions with all these different immunosuppressive medications is, will they actually make a vaccine ineffective? The whole point of a vaccine is to educate your immune system. It stimulates your immune system in response to something that could infect you so that it learns how to fight that infection. And just like a child in the classroom, it's really hard to educate your immune system if it's asleep. This is some data that shows that there is, in fact, a lower likelihood of benefit from a vaccine if you're on an immunosuppressive medication. And there's a bit of an alphabet soup here. These are different antigens that were used for the H1N1 flu vaccine in this study. And these are the healthy people in yellow. IBD patients who are on a non-immunosuppressive medication. Mesalamine does not suppress your immune system. And then IBD patients who are on an anti-TNF like Remicade or azathioprine. These are drugs that suppress your immune system. And what you can see is that the blue ones across the board had a lower likelihood of developing a protective immune response after being exposed to the flu shot. So clearly there is a decrease in what we call seroconversion or protective immunity when you get vaccinated while you're on a systemic immunosuppressant like azathioprine or an anti-TNF. And that's for the flu shot. We saw something similar with the pneumonia vaccine. If you're on azathioprine, there's a little bit of a lower seroconversion rate, but the big difference was actually anti-TNFs like infliximab seem to drop your likelihood of protective immunity by a couple dozen percent. So if you can vaccinate somebody while they're not on immunosuppression, it's more likely to give them long-term protection than if you vaccinate them while they're on immunosuppression. The catch-22 is, if you are on an IBD medication, you have more need for protection. So the people who need the protection from infection the most are also the ones who are the hardest to protect. So you're kind of stuck here with immunosuppressive medications, and that's why I typically vaccinate everybody I can get my hands on with IBD, because I don't know if over the next year you're going to suddenly be on prednisone and Remicade and on a whole host of immunosuppressive medications, and I'll be kicking myself that I could have vaccinated you 6 months ago and gotten a nice protective immunity, which now I can't. So bottom line is, vaccinate early before you even know if you're going to need a medication that might weaken your immune system. Now, there are rare exceptions of vaccines that can actually harm you if you have IBD. Now, if you're on no immunosuppressive medication, none of these vaccines, no vaccine has been shown to cause a flare of IBD. So there is no evidence that a vaccine will actually hurt IBD patients if they're on no medication at all. And it also, if it's not a live vaccine, it's not going to hurt you. You can't get an infection from a killed vaccine. And so having an even if you're on very heavy immunosuppression, the vaccine's most likely just to do nothing, not to hurt you. Now, that's the biggest risk. If it is a live vaccine and you're on an immunosuppressant, we're a bit more cautious. So the flu nasal spray, people are cautioned against using that. I mean, there's a shot you can use that's at least as effective. So we always say, just get the shot, don't take the risk. Zostafax, we told people for a long time there might be some risk associated with taking it because it's a live vaccine, but that one, as I said, is obsolete. You shouldn't be using Zostafax, you should be using Shingrix. It works better, it's safer. Yellow fever vaccine is still a live vaccine that we are using. It is, yellow fever is not endemic to the United States, so you're only required to get this vaccine if you are traveling to a place that has endemic yellow fever, like South America. Some of the places in South America won't let you in without a yellow fever vaccine, but there have been cases of people dying from yellow fever infection by using the yellow fever vaccine while immunosuppressed with a major biopharmaceutical like a Remicade. So we don't recommend that people who are on heavy-duty immunosuppression ever get the yellow fever vaccine. If you're required to travel to darkest Bolivia, you're going to, I mean, we discourage you from going in the first place. And if you do need to go, you're going to need to use a lot of mosquito netting and non-immune-based therapies to try and protect yourself from yellow fever. And you're going to need to get a note from the State Department excusing you. Now, the one thing that we hear all the time is, I don't get flu shots anymore because when I got the flu shot, it gave me the flu. It didn't protect me from the flu. It's not possible for a flu shot to actually give you influenza virus. There is no influenza virus in the flu. There's just ground up, I mean, there are parts of influenza. It's the hemagglutinin protein, but there's no intact virus. It can't actually infect you. However, vaccines are supposed to cause an immune response, and it is the immune response to influenza that makes you feel sick. So it's actually good news if you feel really bad the day after your vaccine, because it means it worked. If your vaccine actually gives you kind of flu-y symptoms, but milder fever, aches, headache, fatigue, soreness at your injection site, that actually says that your immune system is very active. It's putting out a lot of what we call cytokines that cause you to feel kind of crummy, but they also teach your immune system how to really fight off this thing if you get infected. Now, you should not get respiratory symptoms. The problem with flu is not the aches and the headaches. It is that it can actually compromise your ability to breathe, which is kind of important. The vaccine cannot hurt your respiratory system. So if you start to get pulmonary symptoms, that's something else. That's not the flu shot. That's something else you need to go and take a look at. So typically the crummy feelings you get from a vaccine usually resolve within a day, rarely 2 days. They're not harmful to your health. They just make you feel bad. And I should point out that while these are not unheard of with the flu shot, they're downright common with the Shingrix vaccine. So probably part of the reason why the Shingrix vaccine works so well is it makes you feel really bad. So people commonly get a really sore arm after they get the Shingrix vaccine, and it's also very common for it to cause some of these symptoms like just fatigue, low-grade fever, malaise, muscle aches and pains. So just a word of warning, I do recommend the Shingrix vaccine, but I apologize in advance how you're going to feel the next day. So now for the part of the talk that everybody was really waiting for. Where are we with the COVID-19 vaccines? So giving myself a crash course on this over the past month, it turns out that there's an awful lot going on with COVID-19 vaccines, and they're not all created equal. So to break this down, there's really 4 major types of vaccines that are being developed. mRNA vaccines are probably the closest to doing something. There are also some protein-based vaccines, inactivated versions of the virus, and then a live adenoviral version of the virus that's got pieces of the COVID into a chimpanzee adenovirus. That's the AstraZeneca one you might have heard of in this past month. These all have their relative pros and cons. mRNA vaccines are brand new. I should point out we have never used an mRNA vaccine successfully for an infection before. So we were totally unsure what to expect from the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna that just were described this month, last month. They are comparatively easy to modify. So the cool thing about them is if the COVID comes back next year with a different sequence, it's pretty easy to just change the vaccine and give it again. They're not hard to adapt to an adapting virus. The problem is that mRNA is very unstable, so you have to freeze it very deeply in order to use it and thaw it right before use. But they do appear to be more potent than DNA or protein, we're starting to learn. Now, protein vaccines, this is really an old tried and true technology. Just use proteins from the virus and put it in what we call adjuvant. These are nice and stable. You can keep them in a fridge. They don't need to be frozen, but they're much less potent than RNA vaccines. Inactivated viruses are probably the oldest type of virus, like Jonas Salk would just culture virus, kill it in formalin, and then give that. They are more complicated. There's more in them, and so you tend to get off-target side effects because there's lots of different proteins in a killed virus. Similarly, a live adenovirus is complicated. It has lots of different pieces, parts to it, and so AstraZeneca actually had to stop their trial for a while when it looked like some weird neurologic side effects were happening from an immune reaction because it is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. But the benefit is that adenoviruses are self-replicating, so it may be quicker for AstraZeneca to beef up its stocks than the people who are making mRNA vaccines. So why are we so excited about mRNA vaccines? Well, they're different because the old vaccines, the live attenuated viruses or the killed virus or just the protein from the virus, that triggers what we call the humoral immune system. By that we mean antibodies. Antibodies are good at fighting something outside of a cell. So antibodies are floating around in your serum, and when they see the virus, they stick to it and your immune system clears it. But they're not very good at fighting anything that is inside the cell. For that, you need what's called the cellular immune system, in particular what are called cytotoxic or killer T cells. And these actually interfere with the cell's ability to make the proteins that make the virus. And so they actually attack and kill the cell before it's even started releasing the virus. And so you can kind of think about it this way. Every nucleated cell in your body has this assembly line. For you cellular biology buffs, it's called the endoplasmic reticulum. But this is where mRNA gets turned into protein. And the protein gets spat out of the cell, and that's what gets picked up by the antibodies in your bloodstream. And that mRNA can come, I mean, it's supposed to come from your own DNA. Your DNA makes RNA and your RNA makes protein. But when the virus infects you, it brings in its own RNA to make its own protein to make its own virus. The vaccine is basically taking a page out of the virus's book and it's putting vaccine RNA in to stimulate an immune response without making a whole virus. Now, the cool thing about this is that there are what are called killer T cells that are actually built to recognize, they basically sample the assembly line while the virus is still being made, and they destroy the cell before it really even has a chance to make the virus and release it everywhere. So in addition to getting this antibody response from any protein that happens to get made by this assembly line, you're also going to be getting your cytotoxic T cells, which have an excellent memory to sample the assembly line and give you a whole extra level of protection beyond what an antibody can do. And so this was November 9th. Just barely less than a month ago, we got the first preliminary analysis from the Pfizer-BioNTech analysis, which was a study that involved 2 doses, 3 weeks apart, a total of almost 44,000 recipients, exactly half and half between placebo and vaccine. And what they saw over the course of less than 2 months was about 160 cases of COVID-19. And the reason they said this was 95% effective was because 95% of the COVID-19 they saw was in the people who did not get the virus. And so this is what the numbers actually look like. 43,500 participants, equally split between placebo and RNA. And what's really important is this was done entirely in a randomized, blinded way. So you can count on the fact that the 21,750 people in this group look exactly like the 21,750 people in this group. Exactly the same age demographics, exactly the same racial breakdown, exactly the same medical comorbidities. There's no possibility of anything biasing anything. And when you have 44,000 people and you flip coins, you can pretty much count on the results being exactly equal. So they followed them for less than 2 months. And as I said, 152 of them got COVID-19, 8 of them in the placebo group and only 8 in the vaccine group. Very statistically significant. And also importantly, all of the severe cases of COVID-19 were in the placebo group, 11 of them. Now, maybe if they had a larger group, they would have seen a few in the people who got the vaccine. But as far as we know, there wasn't a single severe case of COVID-19 warranting hospitalization within those who got the vaccine. Now, remember what I said about how flu shots might make you feel punky, and shingles shots in particular might make you feel punky? Sounds like the Pfizer vaccine really makes you feel punky. So the official word is that there haven't actually been more than a few % of patients who experience serious side effects from it, but our experience here in Seattle has been that pretty much everybody who got the real vaccine had symptoms the next day. So fever, fatigue, headaches, muscle aches, and really by far the most common thing is just your arm hurts. It causes injection site reactions. But there have not been any serious safety concerns. All of these problems go away within a day or two, and nobody ends up in the hospital from just feeling kind of punky the next day. And why do I know this? Because my employer, the Benaroya Research Institute, was the site of recruitment for the COVID-19 vaccine for Pfizer. Granted, Seattle is just one city in a global study, so 44,000 people from all over the planet. There's only 81 of us from Seattle. But I'm very proud of the fact that we were the site that did this to a large extent because the MD who was seeing a lot of the patients in this trial is in itty bitty over here, my wife, the other Dr. Lord. So if I can sort of promote my own family here, I'm very proud of my wife for having sort of dropped everything in her diabetes research to support saving the planet this past fall. And she worked her tail off on this, folks. So got to have a hand for the other Dr. Lord. Moderna did the same thing. We were not involved with this trial, but they basically did the exact same things that Pfizer did. They had an mRNA vaccine, only 30,000 patients, not quite as big, but exactly the same result, 95% effective. So they got 90 cases instead of 160, but only 5 of those cases were in the vaccine recipients. So vast majority of the COVID that they saw in their trial was in placebo recipients. So where are we? Well, we're expecting the FDA to grant approval to the mRNA vaccines any day now. Both of these are expected to be approved sometime this month. I'd be hopeful that Pfizer would be approved sometime this week, as it's already been approved in Great Britain. And Moderna filed about 2 weeks after Pfizer, so that'll probably happen closer to Christmas. The Pfizer CEO had announced that they're capable of producing enough vaccine for 15 to 20 million recipients by the end of 2020. Granted, this is for the entire planet, so very few of these will actually go to the United States. But the US government has contracted for 100 million doses, which means 50 million people over the next calendar year. Pfizer anticipates potentially being able to produce 1.3 billion doses in 2021. I read recently that much of the first 6 months of their production is largely already spoken for, so the US probably won't get more than 50 million doses before June, but that is enough to cover roughly 1/6 or 1/7 of the entire US population. So that's actually pretty good, and if carefully applied, may do a lot to stop transmission in the first 6 months of 2021. Now, distribution is going to be an issue because, as we said, this is a vaccine that requires very cold storage. Pfizer did their trial with a -70 freezer or liquid nitrogen that's even colder. There's a finite number of liquid nitrogen out there, no liquid nitrogen storage tanks and deep -70 freezers. So that may actually limit our ability to distribute the Pfizer vaccine. Moderna conducted their trial with a -20, which is basically the same freezer you have in your kitchen. So Moderna's may actually be able to be applied outside of major metropolitan areas where distribution is a bigger issue. But we'll see what Moderna's production capabilities look like in probably 2021. So suffice to say, there is a lot of argument right now over who to prioritize. I think the top of the list right now are probably healthcare workers and first responders. In part, the concern that they could be super spreaders themselves, in part because we're dependent upon them to handle the people who do get sick from COVID. But in close competition with them are the people who work in nursing homes who've been the most vulnerable to the people who work and live in nursing homes who've been the most vulnerable to the vaccine. And then, of course, people who are known to have high-risk conditions. In addition to old age, there's diabetes and obesity that have been identified as risk factors for COVID-19, and so they'll probably be prioritized as well. I regret to inform you that inflammatory bowel disease itself is not a known high-risk condition for COVID-19. The risk of severe outcomes with IBD looked exactly the same as it did for people without IBD, so it's unlikely that simply having the diagnosis of IBD is going to be a risk factor. But in all honesty, we don't really know. So it's impossible to know what the long-term safety profile of any vaccine that's been so recently developed is. But what I can tell you as a biologist is that it really is inconceivable that an mRNA vaccine could cause cancer. To do that, it would have to get into your DNA, which means it would have to be DNA. And the street's all one way. DNA turns into RNA. RNA does not turn into DNA outside of a retroviral infection. mRNA is very unstable, so the vaccine itself should disappear very rapidly. So don't expect that a few days later there's still going to be any of the actual vaccine still in your bloodstream, for what it's worth. Also, only one little part of the virus is encoded by the mRNA. It's the spike protein on the surface of it. So it's missing the rest of the virus. So it can't actually cause COVID-19. So you don't need to worry about getting COVID-19 from the vaccine and transmitting it to your family. It doesn't work like that. So biologically, we know that at least you're safe from those. What we don't know is what it's going to do in people with a chronic inflammatory condition. People with inflammatory bowel disease and other issues like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, they were all excluded from the Pfizer trial and the Moderna trials. So we have no idea what mRNA vaccines do in people who have inflammatory bowel disease. Clearly, there is a robust immune response to an mRNA vaccine, probably because it's getting those killer T cells involved. We don't really know how important killer T cells are to the pathogenesis of IBD. So it's possible we're in some new territory here where, unlike every vaccine we've ever seen before, maybe this one could cause a flare of IBD, but we don't know yet. Nothing else has so far. We also don't know how effective it is in people who are on immunosuppressive medications like the ones we use to treat IBD. Given our experience with other vaccines, I can feel almost certain that you're not going to see the wonderful 95% protection that you would get in a person, in the people who are in the COVID trial. Nobody in the Pfizer trial was on an immunosuppressive medication. So my guess is your seroconversion rate won't be as good as 95% in getting protection from the COVID vaccine if you're on an anti-TNF or certainly prednisone. But it's almost certainly better than nothing. But I think my word of caution would be, don't get the vaccine and just assume that you're bulletproof now and you can go hang out at bars without a mask. If you're on an immunosuppressive medication, you're probably a little less likely to be protected from the vaccine than most people. So it's not going to be 95%. I will say one interesting thing about the safety profile, which I didn't put in this talk because I was just talking to my wife about it on our walk home today. BRI, where I work, is actually trying to answer this question of what does the safety profile look like in people with chronic inflammatory disease. We're very good at studying autoimmunity inflammation. So we've got the machinery to quickly put up a trial that'll look at people who have an inflammatory condition before and after they get a vaccine. And given that a lot of those people are going to be health workers who are probably going to get the earliest vaccines, we're going to look around our facility and just ask our colleagues, if you have a chronic disease like inflammatory bowel disease, would you be willing to let us draw your blood and monitor you before each of your 2 vaccines and then a few weeks after your second vaccine, and just see what happens to your immune system, what happens to you? Does this actually make you sicker? So we can get that data from our healthcare workers before this goes into widespread distribution in the greater population. So we're trying to answer that question as quickly as we can, as logically as we can, knowing that there's no way we can do this inside the industry-sponsored trials. So we're going to have to use standard of care vaccines, which should be available to healthcare workers pretty soon, we're hoping. Meanwhile, we recommend that everybody maintain social distancing precautions, wear a mask, wash hands, and of course, quarantine if symptomatic. So the vaccine is going to take at least 6 months to really make a big difference in our protection as a society. So bear with us for the first half of 2021. It's probably going to look not that different from the last half of 2020 in terms of what you need to do to protect yourself. But by summer, we're optimistic that we will have made enough headway with these vaccines to really change the epidemic to a level that your chance of infection by being out and about is really extremely slim. Sorry, that was a lot more than 15 minutes. I kind of got carried away a bit.
I love it. That's great. Thank you so much for all the information. It's certainly a wealth, lots for us to think about. I'm going to go back a little bit. I think most of our pre-questions were answered in your presentation, but one that came in was, is Shingrix recommended for all patients on biologics regardless of age? Also, if a patient gets Shingrix in their 30s, for example, will they need it again later in life?
So far as we know right now, Shingrix is just you do it all in 1 year. There's 2 shots up to 6 months apart, and then you never get it again. So it's not something that we know needs a booster, but the vaccine was only developed a couple of years ago. So if years from now we start seeing people get shingles who got Shingrix vaccine 20 years ago, or if we start checking for seroreactivity and we see that people no longer have protective immunity, we may start recommending a booster for Shingrix, but at the moment there is no Shingrix booster. It's just the 2 doses 2 to 6 months apart.
So to be clear, do you recommend that younger people get it if they're on
the second part of the question was whether you should get it if you have IBD. I'm recommending, I didn't put this into my talk, but younger people have typically been vaccinated against chickenpox. And consequently, people who are in their 20s and younger rarely have had chickenpox. We're not seeing a lot of young people who have had chickenpox in their youth. So if you've never had chickenpox and you got the chickenpox vaccine as a child, there is no reason to get a Shingrix vaccine. You're not protecting yourself from anything. You're already immune, and there's no varicella in you. If you had chickenpox as a child, then you should get a shingles vaccine, because that means that the virus is living inside your body. It hides out in your neurons, and that's why you get dermatomal distribution of the rashes, because it comes out of the nerve endings that are fed by that nerve root. And so that's how the virus comes back out of your nervous system and infects your skin. So if you've ever had chickenpox, you'll never get chickenpox again, but you're much more vulnerable to getting shingles than somebody who never had chickenpox. So anybody who had chickenpox in their childhood should get a Shingrix vaccine. Typically, your insurance company will kick and scream if you're under 50, but I usually write a letter arguing that if you have IBD, you're either on an immunosuppressive medication or at risk of being put on an immunosuppressive medication. And those are known to increase your risk of developing shingles and increase your risk of having a really severe outcome like disseminated zoster, which can affect your lungs if you get shingles while you're on an anti-TNF or some other highly immunosuppressive drug. So another reason to make sure that you get the shingles vaccine is you might get more than just shingles if you get shingles on Remicade. It can actually cause a very deadly disease like shingles does in pregnancy.
All right, very good. That's helpful. That pneumonia vaccine, if you had it 7 years ago, would you potentially need a booster?
Pneumonia is a complicated one. There are 2 different vaccines, and the recommendation depends on how old you are and which ones were given when. So we usually have to sit down and look at your chart and go over it with you on a case-by-case basis. But pneumonia is complicated. I have a hard time keeping it straight. Looks like what the CDC is recommending is a single dose of Prevnar. This is assuming you're immunosuppressed or IBD or going to be potentially on prednisone. Single dose of Prevnar, and then at least 8 weeks later, but whenever later, you get a dose of Pneumovax, and then 5 years after that, you get another Pneumovax. And then after you turn 65 and are at least 5 years since your last Pneumovax, you get your 3rd dose of Pneumovax. If you don't have IBD and you're healthy as a horse and you're not on immunosuppressives, then just get a Pneumovax after you turn 65.
So the probably underlier there is to talk to your doctor about it, just to be sure.
Pneumonia is complicated. That's a hard one to give kind of a simple answer to.
Very good. How different is the immune response of the mRNA-based vaccines from that of the classic ones in IBD patients? And you kind of covered that we don't necessarily know.
So Pfizer is doing that research themselves, and we're not allowed to touch those patients, which is why we haven't been able to come up with an answer to that yet, even though we kicked and screamed and tried to get our hands on all of the blood from the people who got the Pfizer vaccine at Virginia Mason. So that's why now that we are seeing the standard of care vaccine being rolled out where Pfizer can't control what their research subjects do, we're asking those patients to donate blood before and after their vaccines so that we understand what's different about this. We've done tons of work on flu shots, so we know what the immune response to a conventional vaccine does. So big question, how does the immune system look different in response to an mRNA vaccine that makes it work so much better than the other vaccines that we've seen in the past? We were expecting like a 70% immune protection from this. That's what AstraZeneca saw with their conventional adenovirus vaccine. 95% in 2 trials, that is awesome.
Seriously, kudos to your wife and all the team. It's very, very exciting.
Actually, kudos to that Hungarian couple, or I mean, sorry, Turkish-born couple, German couple that emigrated to Germany and started BioNTech. This is really, I mean, gosh, I think they're going to have an off-season Nobel Prize just for those guys.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to read this exactly to make sure that I don't get it wrong. How does an mRNA vaccine, while on long-term use of immunosuppression, specifically anti-TNF alpha biologics like infliximab, impact adaptive immune response? As an mRNA induces a different immune mechanism, will we see a difference in seroconversion as opposed to influenza vaccines?
It may be that seroconversion is not even that good of a marker of protective immunity with an mRNA vaccine, because as I mentioned, in addition to driving the B cell response that makes antibodies that we measure by seroconversion, we're also going to see T cells responding. Killer T cells are capable of recognizing something that's produced off of mRNA in the endoplasmic reticulum, which antibodies are not. At least not till it's exported from the cell or presented to a CD4 helper T cell. So the immune system is a different part of your immune system that's capable of responding to something with an mRNA vaccine that might not actually be reflected in your seroconversion. So protective immunity to COVID-19 may actually not have that much to do with your antibodies. It may actually be your killer T cells, which are much harder to measure with current technology. I think there's probably going to be a rush to figure out how do you find protective T cells, and there's a company here in Seattle called Adaptive TCR or Adaptive Biosystems that is currently well on its way to figuring out how to find the T cells that protect you from COVID-19 out of the entire host of T cells that are in your bloodstream. And so I think you're going to see assays like adaptives that start to measure T cell response as opposed to antibody response. I think that's the second half of your question. What was the first half? It's kind of confusing. It's about the immune system.
How does an mRNA vaccine, while on long-term use of immunosuppressions like biologics, impact adaptive immune response?
Boy, that's a huge question. And that's something we're actively investigating. Many labs are actively investigating. Surprisingly little has been discovered about how anti-TNFs change the nature of your immune system. We know it weakens it in some way, but there doesn't really appear to be a real consistent effect. So that's kind of a dead horse. We've been studying anti-TNFs for 20 years and we still haven't really found anything, but some of the newer biologics like Stelara and Entyvio are a lot narrower than the anti-TNFs. And so I know our group and probably another number of other groups are really actively trying to understand what effect they're having on the immune system. There, the footprint is a lot more specific, a lot more consistent. And Donna shows, who I can see on my screen right here in front of me, is actively engaged in this effort trying to understand how, in particular, vedolizumab affects the immune system. But we're moving into Stelara as well to try and understand how that arm of the immune system responds. And we're finding some fairly interesting things. Actually, Donna was the one who did all the Stelara experiments. So
I love it. We have a very intelligent audience. Yes. Okay, can you test for efficacy after you get a vaccine?
Well, with a conventional vaccine, you look for antibodies. So like with the flu, hemagglutinin, you just look for antibodies to hemagglutinin, like that study I showed you with all the different antigens that they put in there. Each of those alphabet soup at the bottom of the graph is just a different protein that they measure the ability of antibodies to stick to those from a patient's bloodstream. Antibodies are pretty easy to measure because they're dead. They're just molecules. Cells are a lot tougher because cells are living things, and so it's tricky to ask a question of a cell. But cells do have some unique signatures, like the DNA that encodes their T cell receptors, the one that Adaptive is using. And so that may be a more effective way to kind of study the immune response to an mRNA vaccine or to COVID itself. So I think there's a lot of open questions in terms of what happens with COVID. And when we've looked at T cells, the Benaroya Research Institute and the University of Washington have worked together on a publication that came out this year in JCI that demonstrated that if you look beyond the antibodies, with COVID-19, they talk about how the antibodies show up and then they disappear, but people don't seem to get COVID again. There are immune cells that are specific to COVID that look and act differently after the infection that you can track long term, and those don't ever seem to go anywhere. And so we may be looking at the wrong thing by just using antibodies because they're easy to study. But yeah, there does appear to be a cellular immune response that is very durable, and that was published in JCI by a number of collaborators here in Seattle this year.
Excellent. Okay, then we have a comment from Kayla, who is a healthcare worker with IBD in Phoenix, saying that she would be happy to help with your research or contribute to your data. So we can connect there if there's something. And next question, thank you,
We
Kayla.
want to like 3 times, you have to come to Virginia Mason 3 times, once before each shot and then 3 weeks after the last shot. That's a lot of airfare.
It's a nice offer. Okay, how does older age also affect efficacy?
You know, actually, the interesting thing about the COVID-19 vaccine is they did bias it towards, the Pfizer trial was biased towards older people. So at least half of the people in it were over the age of, I think, 45. I don't have my wife's slides. She's putting together a talk of her own for Grand Rounds next Friday, but I think she said it was like half the people are over 45. So there's a bias towards people my age and up. And so that 95% efficacy you're seeing is across the board. And the oldest people were, I think, in their 90s. So some of the most at-risk individuals were deliberately included in that trial so that we could see the signal. And they seem to be protected just as the same as everyone else was.
Wow, that's excellent. Do we know if ustekinumab is, my words aren't working, impacts the ustekinumab?
That's ustekinumab is Stelara.
Okay. Does it impact the efficacy of vaccines, or do we know?
It hasn't been studied. So that's the newest kid on the block. It was FDA approved for ulcerative colitis just a year ago and for Crohn's disease about 3 years ago. So we have had it for psoriasis for 10 years, but it's so expensive, it hasn't been very popular for psoriasis. So we have a very small number in dermatology, much larger number in IBD, but for a very short period of time. So it hasn't been heavily studied. It is much narrower than an anti-TNF. So TNF is made by lots and lots of cells in your immune system. So it's really hard to tell where the Remicade class of drugs works. But the IL-23 blockers like Stelara and a bunch of others that are in phase 3 trial right now, those really only affect a handful of cells in the immune system, Th17s, mate cells, maybe a couple of other cell populations. So it's a very, very narrow group of immune cells that may not be that important for protecting you against viruses. But the true answer is we don't know. You know, when we think we know what's going on in biology, a lot of times biology surprises us. So at some point we'll find the answer, and it may actually be really important for COVID vaccine. That's where we really have no idea whether there's a problem. We have not seen any increased rates of flu or in common things like flu and pneumonia. They happen all the time. And we've not seen a safety signal associated with Stelara the way we did with flu and pneumonia in Remicade recipients. So my guess is if they don't impair your protection against the actual influenza and the actual pneumonia, they probably don't impair your ability to get protective immunity to the pneumonia and flu shots, but we don't know.
Okay, we'll try to get through these quickly, but there's a couple here about whether there are trials planned to specifically address the efficacy of COVID vaccine with IBD patients or immunosuppressed patients generally. Are there?
Not at this scale. Like I said, we are in the process of initiating a small trial just here in Seattle to look at healthcare workers who are getting standard care vaccine who happen to have inflammatory bowel disease. That's more of a safety study. We're more concerned with, does it make your IBD flare, and you know, are there more side effects from it? I mean, do you feel a whole lot worse the next day than somebody who doesn't have IBD? So those are our main questions. We know that side effects are common with this. Do they last a lot longer than a day if you have a chronic condition? And do they cause disease exacerbation? We may get a few people who are on immunosuppression, but we're trying to preferentially recruit people who are on no medications with stable diseases in remission. Because we do expect that whatever effect it's going to have is going to be dampened by effective therapy.
Very good. So we have like 10 more questions. So I'm going to keep going. If you need to log off, feel free. We are going to save this recording so that you'll be able to catch the questions later. And then Dr. Lord, if you have a hard end period, we could try to answer some of the questions later as well. So that's what we'll do. We'll just kind of keep going until Dr. Lord gets tired. Okay, so could we implement mRNA vaccines to treat other infections like HIV?
Wow, wouldn't that be awesome? We've certainly opened a new box here, and I think that one of the silver linings to this great black cloud of COVID-19 is that mRNA vaccines might be a game changer for viral disease, and we may be seeing cures to things that we used to consider incurable, like dengue fever and HIV and hepatitis C, things that were previous. Well, I mean, you can cure hepatitis C with drugs, but it might be something we can protect people from ever getting with a vaccine.
That's pretty exciting to think about. Okay, how do they give you something that has to stay so cold?
They thaw it out right before, and it's stable for about 2 days.
Okay, confirming then that the live adenovirus vaccine would not be recommended for an IBD patient on immune suppressant medication.
Yeah, I wouldn't. It's actually a chimpanzee vaccine, the AstraZeneca one. They took a chimpanzee adenovirus that makes chimpanzees very sick, but it generally doesn't cause any symptoms in humans. We're awfully close to chimpanzees, so it may not take much for it to kind of actually make you sick if you have a suppressed immune system. I wouldn't mess around with the AstraZeneca vaccine if you're on an immunosuppressant. Plus, it just doesn't work that well. It's only 70% effective. And that's inclusive of the small subset that got a reduced dose for some reason. Their data is really confusing. They got a 58% efficacy in the global population that used it correctly, but in Great Britain, they made a mistake and they gave a half dose of it. And so in those people, for some reason, it worked better. It's probably just a statistical fluke that maybe COVID was better managed in England or something, but for whatever reason, they had a much lower rate of transmission, and so they got like a 90% efficacy in that subgroup in England. So if you average them together, it's around 70% efficacy, which it just doesn't hold a candle to the mRNA vaccines.
Interesting, very interesting. Do you have an idea of when it would be possible for IBD patients to get the COVID vaccines in Seattle?
Probably this summer. I mean, I think that you're going to, I mean, it depends on who you are. If you're a nursing home resident, you're probably going to get it sometime this winter. If you are, depending on, we're probably then just going to walk from oldest to youngest. I mean, with the exception of a couple things like obesity and diabetes, a lot of these conditions haven't really shown a real safety signal. And so the IBD itself is not going to put you at the front of the line. What will is if you have diabetes or if you are older, and then we're probably largely, for the most people, we're just going to start at the oldest and work our way back. And so the last people to get vaccinated will be kids.
Okay. Let's see. Do you recommend that people who are about to start Remicade and are not in serious pain wait until they get the COVID-19 vaccine?
No, because there's a pandemic on, and if you don't treat yourself with an effective medication like Remicade, you're going to get a crummy medication like prednisone to keep you out of the hospital, and that markedly increases your risk of dying from COVID-19. Actually, I take that back. It markedly increases your risk of going into the ICU, with COVID-19. Once you actually have a tube down your throat and you're on a ventilator, for some reason, drugs like prednisone actually prevent you from dying. But they kind of funnel you to the worst case scenario and then leave you there. So I don't recommend people preferentially use prednisone over an anti-TNF right now. Anti-TNFs are definitely less risky for COVID-19 than prednisone. So I would not delay effective therapy. You're going to hop out of that frying pan right into the fire.
You mentioned this distribution based on age or what have you. Do you anticipate that like your clinic would start calling patients and say, you're up, it's your turn for a vaccine, or would the patient be responsible for reaching out and saying, is it my turn yet? Is it my turn yet?
I think that's above my pay grade. I mean, I think the federal government is going to tell us how the vaccine is going to be distributed.
Okay. Let's see. So this is kind of a summary of what we've been discussing. Is it recommended that people who are immune suppressed can safely take the vaccine, or is it best to wait?
If you can get it, get it. I mean, if you think you're about to stop your immunosuppression, in particular if you're on a prednisone taper and it's almost done, wait until you're off the prednisone before you get any vaccine. It'll just work better. It's not any more dangerous. It's just likely to be less effective the more immunosuppressed you are. So if you're on something really heavy right now and you're about to come off it, like cyclosporin, Xeljanz, or Remicade, wait until you're done with those if they're temporary. If you're on something chronic and long-term like azathioprine or a biologic drug, don't mess with success. Stay on your medicine, get the vaccine, and just know that some protection is better than none, but you're probably not going to get that 95% of protection that most people get.
Very good. And then let's see, we're just about through here. If the question is, if we do take the vaccine, are we likely to become infected with the virus? I think you've kind of covered that as well.
No, the vaccine most certainly will not give you coronavirus. That is a physical impossibility. You are less likely to get coronavirus after you've been vaccinated than before you're vaccinated, just in terms of your overall exposure. You are less protected by the vaccine if you're on an immunosuppressant than somebody who is not on an immunosuppressant, but you still are probably going to get at least some protection from the vaccine. The big unknown right now is whether, because it's an mRNA vaccine, it might make you feel crummier the next day than one that's not, because you have IBD. And that's the question we're trying to answer right now with our healthcare workers who are going to get the vaccine early and happen to have a chronic autoimmune disease, is do they have worse side effects from it? And is it anything we need to worry about in those patients? If that is the case, we may actually end up saying, yes, you should stay on an immunosuppressive medication to mitigate any side effects from it, but knowing that that's going to undermine its efficacy. So stay tuned. We need to figure out whether this is something to be worried about or not.
All right, we're going to do one more question and then we're going to wrap it up. Do you have any information on the Johnson & Johnson trial that is more of the conventional vaccine prototype?
I have not heard anything about the J&J trial. It's well beyond the other three, behind the other three. It was stopped for an extended period of time because I believe somebody had was it Guillain-Barré? There was a pretty bad side effect that shut down that trial for a period of time. So they've had some trouble recruiting, and they probably aren't going to announce their results until either later this month or sometime early 2021. And so at that point, they can start the filing process for FDA approval. But given that they actually did have some toxicity, that's going to really slow down their approval. So I wouldn't hold my breath for J&J. They probably won't be out until well into 2021. And I mean, you can't get much better than 95% efficacy. So the only reason why we're going to see other types of vaccines coming to the marketplace is because the front runners aren't going to be able to keep up. There's going to be demand exceeding supply for mRNA-based vaccines. And so there will be some room for companies like AstraZeneca to market their vaccine. I think the big question we're going to see is, if you got one vaccine, are two vaccines better than one? We don't know. I wouldn't bother getting a second vaccine if you manage to get an mRNA up front. You're not going to get much better than 95% protection. So don't waste your time and risk with a second vaccine. If you got AstraZeneca's, would you benefit from subsequently getting a Pfizer? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not going to recommend it until we have mRNA vaccines coming out our ears, because certainly somebody who's gotten no vaccine is going to get more benefit from that one dose of mRNA vaccine than you will. So yeah, wait until everybody else has had a vaccine before asking for seconds.
Very good. Okay, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and close down the questions. If somebody who's still online has more questions, feel free to email them to me and we can kind of sort through those in the next day. Otherwise, I guess we would end by saying that in terms of your normal vaccines, if you are questioning whether or not you're current, talk with your GI, talk with your general provider, get square on that. It really is important to take care of those maintenance things. As long as we are in this situation that we're in now, as Dr. Lord mentioned, it's a continuation of the social distancing, the wearing a mask, staying in small groups. We can ride this thing out together. We've been doing a good job, so we just got to stay the course. We've got great researchers right here in Seattle and around the world. So once those vaccines are ready, there's more information to come, but certainly consider that getting them is maybe the best option for getting back to where our world is. So any closing comment, James?
Get vaccinated. You're better protected than not. And until the COVID vaccine comes out, keep doing the common sense protection that has been recommended by the CDC.
All right. Well, with that, I want to once again thank Takeda, Seattle Children's Hospital, Swedish Washington Gastroenterology, and Primera for partnering with us on this program. Extreme thanks to Dr. Lord, Benaroya Research Institute, Virginia Mason, and all of you for taking your time tonight with this presentation. We will be posting it so that you can follow up with anything that you wanted to. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming out tonight. I see a lot of familiar names and faces in the audience.
Yeah, so good. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night.